The way Americans live and move across the country is clearly shifting, and more people are only now starting to realize it. Even though some places keep getting pushed as the top destinations, recent U.S. Census Bureau data tells a much more detailed and different story. In this video, we explore the top 10 fastest-growing U.S. states in 2026, focusing on where people are actually moving and what's behind those decisions. We'll break down real population growth, look at domestic migration trends reshaping the country, and highlight the states gaining residents faster than most headlines suggest. This isn't just about statistics. It's about where people feel there's opportunity, where life seems more manageable, and which states are quietly on the rise. So before relying on outdated rankings, watch this countdown to see what the latest 2026 migration trends are really showing. If you enjoy this kind of content, subscribe to discover the cities, watch to the end, and comment which state you think is growing the fastest right now. Coming in at number 10, we've got Tennessee. Tennessee takes the 10th spot. And no, this isn't one of those overly hyped growth stories where a place adds a handful of people, maybe a new gas station, and suddenly pretends it's the heart of the American dream. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, Tennessee's population increased from 7,251,291 to 7,315,076 between July 1st, 2024 and July 1st, 2025. That works out to an increase of 63,785 people, or roughly 0.9% growth, which also places the state 8th nationwide in terms of raw population gains. So if you're thinking Tennessee just barely made the list, it's worth reconsidering. Tens of thousands of people across the country looked around and decided, yeah, I'd rather move there. What really stands out about Tennessee is that its growth isn't being carried by just one standout city doing all the heavy lifting. While other parts of the country seem unsure about where things are headed, data from the Tennessee State Data Center shows that 81 out of 95 counties actually saw population increases in 2025, with especially strong momentum across the eastern two-thirds of the state. Davidson County led in total growth, adding 9,281 new residents, while counties like Rutherford, Wilson, Montgomery, Williamson, and Sumner all continued to trend upward as well. Maury County, for example, posted a solid 3.2% growth rate, which is definitely not subtle or easy to overlook. All of this points to one clear takeaway: Tennessee's appeal is spreading far beyond the usual headline-grabbing cities. Now here's the key piece if you're trying to understand what's really driving this trend. The Tennessee State Data Center makes it clear that net domestic migration is the primary force behind the state's population growth. Put simply, people from across the U.S. are actively choosing to move to Tennessee. This isn't just natural population growth quietly nudging the numbers upward. This is real movement, real relocation, with people packing up their lives, loading trucks, and heading somewhere that feels a bit more affordable, a bit less hectic, and maybe just a little less exhausting day to day. That pattern also lines up with broader national moving trends. According to United Van Lines, more Americans are looking for a different pace of life and are choosing to settle outside major metropolitan areas where housing tends to be more affordable. And honestly, that description fits Tennessee pretty well. It's not just about the big-name cities. It's also the surrounding counties, the exurbs, and the smaller metro areas where people feel like they can get more space, breathe a little easier, and maybe find a better deal than wherever they just left behind. So when you see Tennessee ranked at number 10, don't interpret that as the state fading into the background. Instead, see it for what it really is. Tennessee continues to attract a significant number of Americans, even as the post-pandemic surge in relocation begins to level out. At this point, it's no longer just riding a temporary wave. It has firmly established itself as a consistent destination on the relocation map. And if you're wondering why Tennessee keeps coming up in these discussions, the explanation is actually pretty straightforward. A lot of people still believe life might work out better for them there than where they are now. And in the U.S., that belief alone is often enough to drive major population shifts. At number 9, we've got Nevada. Nevada lands in the 9th spot, and honestly, that feels pretty on brand for a state like this. It's one of those places that never really disappears from the relocation conversation, no matter what's going on nationally. Even when the hype fades, the mood shifts, or people start claiming the big moving wave is over, Nevada somehow drifts right back into focus like, you thought I was gone. And based on the latest numbers from the U.S. Census Bureau, a lot of people clearly didn't forget about it. The state's population rose from 3,253,543 in 2024 to 3,282,188 in 2025, adding 28,645 residents, which comes out to about 0.9% growth. That was enough to keep Nevada comfortably in the national top 10 for percentage growth. So no, this isn't just some recycled Las Vegas-era narrative being dusted off again. Nevada is still expanding at a pace that keeps it relevant, while other states are struggling just to maintain their population. And that becomes even more significant when you zoom out and look at the broader national picture. According to census data, overall U.S. population growth slowed to just 0.5% between July 2024 and July 2025. Assistant Division Chief Christine Hartley noted that much of this slowdown comes from a historic drop in net international migration. In simpler terms, this wasn't a year where growth came easily across the board and Nevada just rode the wave. Population gains were harder to come by, and Nevada still managed to stand out. That's the kind of detail people tend to miss when they skim headlines and assume the relocation map has somehow stopped changing. It hasn't. Nevada continues to draw enough attention and interest to stay firmly in the mix. Now, before anyone jumps into the comments acting like Nevada is some endless land of cheap housing, sunshine, and casino glitter, let's take a step back. The reality is a bit more complicated than that. The Associated Press recently described Nevada as a reflection of the broader challenges Americans are facing with rising costs. That observation hits because it cuts straight through the illusion. Yes, people are still moving there, but they're not stepping into some untouched, bargain-filled paradise straight out of 2009. Like much of the country, Nevada is dealing with serious affordability pressures. And honestly, that makes its continued growth even more interesting. It suggests that despite higher costs, plenty of Americans still view Nevada as a better option than where they're currently living. There's another signal that the state is still very much in play. In January 2026, Nevada jumped 15 spots to reach number 20 on the U-Haul Growth Index. Governor Joe Lombardo pointed out that this rise reflects how people are choosing to stay, work, and build their lives in the state. Now, sure, politicians are always going to sound enthusiastic about their own state. No surprise there. But even with that in mind, the bigger takeaway still holds. Nevada isn't just coasting on its past reputation. It's showing up in real, measurable migration patterns. So if you're wondering why Nevada has made its way back into the top 10, the explanation is pretty straightforward. It remains a go-to option for people looking for a reset, lower taxes, a fresh start, or simply a way out of places that feel too expensive, too crowded, or just plain overwhelming. Nevada might not be pulling in people at the same scale as Texas, but it's growing steadily enough to remind everyone that it's still very much in the game. And when a state keeps appearing on these lists even after the relocation surge has cooled, that usually means the pull is real, not just hype. At number 8, we've got Arizona. Arizona claims the 8th spot. And no, this isn't one of those exaggerated growth stories where a place adds a few new subdivisions, opens a smoothie shop, and suddenly acts like it cracked the code to opportunity. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, Arizona's population increased from 7,556,424 in 2024 to 7,623,818 in 2025. That's a gain of 67,394 people, roughly 0.9% growth, which also puts the state 7th in the nation for total numeric increases. So if you're thinking Arizona is just coasting on past reputation, not quite. This is still a state adding a meaningful number of residents, and not in small symbolic amounts either. Real people are continuing to choose Arizona as a place to live. What makes that even more noteworthy is the timing. The census reported that overall U.S. population growth slowed significantly, dropping to just 0.5% between July 2024 and July 2025. Census official Christine Hartley explained that much of this slowdown comes from a historic decline in net international migration. In plain terms, this wasn't a year where growth came easily, and every state just drifted upward along with a booming national trend. Growth became harder to achieve, the overall pace slowed, and Arizona still held its place near the top. That tells you this isn't just surface level or on-paper growth. Arizona has enough real-world appeal to keep attracting people, even as the broader momentum cools. If you had to sum up Arizona's situation in one line, it would be this: not as explosive as before, but still strong enough to matter. A summary from ABC 15 of the latest census release noted that Arizona ranked 7th in total growth and 8th by percentage, even after a noticeable slowdown compared to the previous year. So no, the frenzy isn't what it once was. The state isn't racing ahead the way it did during the peak relocation surge. But don't confuse a slower pace with a full stop. Arizona remains one of those places Americans keep coming back to when they're looking for more space, more sunshine, lower taxes than where they're leaving, or just a chance to feel like life might get a little less overwhelming. You can also see that momentum continuing beneath the surface. Maricopa County alone grew from 4,673,096 residents in 2024 to 4,689,558 in 2025. That's an increase of 16,462 people in just 1 year. In other words, the state's core engine is still expanding, even if it's no longer setting off constant headlines or dramatic spikes. U-Haul's 2025 migration data backs this up, ranking Arizona 7th in the country, with 50.3% of one-way traffic into the state counted as arrivals rather than departures. Even a U-Haul Arizona area vice president pointed to ongoing development, mentioning the rise of microchip plants and data centers, along with new housing projects across Metro Phoenix, Tucson, Prescott Valley, and Dewey-Humboldt. That's an important detail to keep in mind. People aren't just moving to Arizona for desert views or to convince themselves that 108-degree weather somehow feels fine. There are real factors at play: job opportunities, expanding housing, and long-term economic development. So when Arizona shows up at number 8, interpret it correctly. This isn't a state riding leftover hype. It's a place that has cooled down from its most explosive growth phase and is still outperforming much of the country. And honestly, that might be the most impressive part. It's easy to look appealing when everyone is relocating at once. Arizona is still drawing people in even after that surge has faded, and that's when you know the appeal runs deeper than just a trend. At number 7, we've got Washington. Washington comes in at 7th place, and this is where the usual oversimplified relocation narrative really starts to break down. Because every time people talk about population growth in the US, they tend to act like the entire country is just one long migration heading south, chasing cheaper housing, lower taxes, and enough sunshine to cloud their judgment. Meanwhile, Washington quietly pushed past the 8 million resident mark, reminding everyone that growth isn't just a Sun Belt phenomenon. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, Washington's population increased from 7,927,958 in 2024 to just over 8 million in 2025. That's a gain of 73,620 people, roughly 0.9% growth, which also places the state 6th in the nation for total numeric increases. So no, this isn't Washington barely inching forward while surviving on coffee, gray skies, and leftover stock options from Amazon. This is real, measurable momentum, and it stands out even more when you consider the broader national context. The census reported that total U.S. population growth was just 0.5% between July 2024 and July 2025. Census official Christine Hartley explained that much of this slowdown is tied to a historic drop in net international migration. Put simply, growth became harder almost everywhere. The tide went out, the easy gains disappeared, and Washington still managed to rank in the top 10 by percentage growth while also landing 6th in raw numbers. That's not random. That's a state continuing to attract people, even as the national growth engine slows down. Now, if you're thinking this is just Seattle dragging the rest of the state along, it's not quite that simple. Data from the Washington Office of Financial Management shows that while more than 76% of growth happened in the 5 largest metro counties, other parts of the state are growing too, with counties like Whitman, King, and Spokane among the fastest risers. And when you zoom in on cities, strong housing development played a major role in population gains across places like Seattle, Tacoma, Bellevue, Vancouver, Redmond, Shoreline, Spokane, Spokane Valley, Auburn, and Marysville. So this isn't a one-city story. Growth is spreading across an entire network of metro areas and urban centers. That helps explain why Washington keeps showing up in these rankings. According to the same data, net migration has accounted for about 70% of the state's population growth between 2010 and 2025. That's a big deal. It means this isn't just natural population increases quietly padding the numbers. People are actively choosing to move there. As one economist told OPB, population changes reflect where people are voting with their feet. That idea sticks because it cuts through all the noise. People can debate politics, complain about costs, argue about the weather, or question whether they could handle months of gray skies. But migration patterns show what people are actually doing, not just what they're saying. So when Washington lands at number 7, don't treat it like some odd exception in a list dominated by the usual warm weather, low-tax states. Instead, see it as proof that population growth in America is more complex than the simple narrative people like to repeat. Washington is expensive, it's cloudy, and it's definitely not positioning itself as an easy, budget-friendly escape. And yet, it still crossed 8 million residents and added more people than most states in the country. That should tell you something important. Even in a slower year, even with national headwinds, Washington still had enough pull to get people to pack up and move. And that kind of sustained growth is a lot harder to fake. At number 6, we've got Delaware. Delaware takes the 6th spot, and this is usually where people pause for a moment and go, wait, Delaware? Exactly, and that's what makes this entry so interesting. Delaware is the sleeper pick on this list, the kind of state that doesn't dominate relocation headlines, doesn't get hyped up as a national hotspot, and still manages to quietly land in the top 10 for population growth. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, Delaware's population increased from 1,050,123 in 2024 to 1,059,952 in 2025. That's a gain of 9,829 residents, or about 0.9% growth, which was enough to rank 6th in the country by percentage. So no, this isn't one of those massive state stories where hundreds of thousands of people pour in and everyone notices. This kind of growth is more subtle, and honestly, that makes it even more compelling. The timing adds another layer to it. The census reported that the Northeast experienced the sharpest slowdown of any region, with growth dropping from 0.8% to just 0.2% between 2024 and 2025. So for Delaware to break into the national top 10 during a year when its entire region was cooling off, that dramatically isn't some random fluke. It suggests the state was gaining momentum, while many of its neighbors were barely moving at all. Census official Christine Hartley summed up the broader situation by pointing out that the slowdown in U.S. population growth is largely tied to a historic drop in net international migration. In other words, growth was harder to achieve across the board, and Delaware still made the list. That's not artificial momentum. That's real. Now let's be honest for a second. Nobody wakes up one morning and moves to Delaware because they're chasing attention. Delaware isn't trying to position itself as Texas with beaches, Florida with better manners, or North Carolina with a faster track to influence and money. Its identity is much quieter than that. More like, keep things simple, stay organized, and enjoy living in a place small enough to feel efficient. And strangely enough, that might be exactly the appeal. In his 2026 State of the State address, Governor Matt Meyer emphasized themes like clarity, stability, and fairness, suggesting that while other states compete in a race to the bottom, Delaware aims to lead in a more measured way. Now sure, politicians are always going to speak highly of their own state. That's nothing new. But even so, there's a useful takeaway in that message. Delaware is positioning itself as predictable, steady, and a little less chaotic than the alternatives. And that's exactly why it fits so well in this countdown. It may be a surprise entry, but it's not a random one. This is the kind of place people tend to overlook because it's small, understated, and not constantly demanding national attention. Meanwhile, the data shows it's quietly adding residents at a pace that outperforms most of the country in percentage terms. That should tell you something important. Not everyone is chasing the loudest, trendiest, or most overhyped destinations. Sometimes people are drawn to places that feel manageable, well-connected, and stable enough to make everyday life a little easier. So if Delaware feels like the unexpected pick on this list, that's actually a good thing. Every solid countdown needs at least one entry that makes people realize they haven't been paying close attention. We're officially halfway through now. If you're enjoying the video so far, consider hitting the like button, subscribing to Discover the Cities, and turning on notifications so you don't miss future content. Alright, let's keep it moving. At number 5, we've got Utah. Utah takes the 5th spot, and this is where the list starts to frustrate anyone who expects every growth story to follow the exact same script. Because not every fast-growing state is being fueled by a wave of newcomers escaping somewhere expensive, overcrowded, and mentally draining. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, Utah's population increased from 3,502,983 in 2024 to 3,538,904 in 2025. That's a gain of 35,921 residents, or about 1% growth, making Utah the 5th fastest-growing state in the country. So yes, Utah is growing quickly, but what really sets it apart is how that growth is happening. Here's the key detail to focus on, especially if you're assuming Utah is just another migration hotspot with scenic mountains. Census data shows that Utah's growth was driven primarily by natural change, meaning births minus deaths played a bigger role than migration this time. That's a significant shift. The same census report notes that in the previous year, net international migration was actually the largest contributor to Utah's growth, but that slowed down in 2025. In other words, Utah didn't need to rely as heavily on people moving in from elsewhere to stay near the top. The state has enough built-in demographic momentum to keep expanding even when migration cools off. That's not hype, that's structural strength. And local data supports that conclusion. The Kem C. Gardner Policy Institute reported that natural change accounted for 57% of Utah's population growth, while net migration made up the remaining 43%. That's not a narrow margin. It clearly shows that Utah's growth story is different from the migration-heavy narrative people often default to. KSL summed it up even more directly, noting that natural change drove Utah's growth at roughly double the contribution of migration. So if you're thinking Utah only grows when people arrive with fresh home equity and big expectations, that's not what happened here. Utah is still generating growth from within. That doesn't mean migration stopped playing a role. It just means the balance shifted. KSL also pointed out that this was the first time since the COVID-era surge that net migration didn't outpace natural growth. They quoted senior demographer Emily Harris, who explained that this marks a return to Utah's more traditional growth patterns from before the recent spike in migration. And that really says it all. Utah is still growing. It's just doing it the Utah way again. Less frenzy, more fundamentals. Less panic buying and sudden surges, more steady, built-in momentum that continues even after the relocation boom has cooled. So when Utah shows up at number 5, don't interpret it as just another trendy destination riding a temporary wave. Instead, see it as a reminder that some states aren't just attracting new residents. They're structured to keep growing even when migration slows down. And honestly, that's a more impressive position to be in. Trends come and go. A trendy place can get too expensive, lose its appeal, or eventually become the exact kind of place people are trying to leave. But Utah still added nearly 36,000 residents during a slower year nationally and held onto a top 5 position. That tells you this isn't just a place people are choosing. It's a state with enough internal momentum to keep moving forward, even when the broader growth engine starts to slow and sputter. At number 4, we've got Texas. Texas takes the 4th spot, and this is where things stop feeling neat and tidy and start getting a little absurd, in a very Texas kind of way. Because while Texas wasn't the fastest growing state by percentage, it still dominated the country in raw population gains. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, Texas grew from 31,318,578 people in 2024 to 31,709,821 in 2025. That's an increase of 391,243 residents in just 1 year, or about 1.2% growth. So if you're thinking Texas has somehow faded into the background, that's not even close. It basically added the equivalent of an entire city, while other states were celebrating a few new neighborhoods and a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Even in a slower year nationally, no other state came close to that level of sheer growth. What really separates Texas from many of the states ranked above it is how that growth is happening. It's not being driven by just one factor. Census data shows that Texas expanded through a mix of natural population increase and net international migration. Even though migration slowed, the state still added 157,111 residents through natural change alone, with 390,023 births compared to 232,492 deaths. On top of that, Texas welcomed 167,475 international migrants in 2025. So yes, people are still moving in, but Texas is also generating population growth internally at a scale most states can't match. That's exactly why Texas remains such a heavyweight in these rankings. It doesn't need to lead in percentage growth when it's adding people by the hundreds of thousands. Now, before anyone assumes Texas is still operating at peak, breakneck speed, let's put things into perspective. Reporting from the Texas Tribune noted that the state's 1.2% growth rate is actually its slowest since 2021. State demographer Lloyd Potter even pointed out that this could signal slower economic expansion compared to what Texas has historically experienced. That's an important detail. Texas is still growing aggressively, but the pace has cooled compared to the peak relocation boom. The same report highlighted that net domestic migration added 67,299 residents in 2025, a sharp drop from 222,154 in 2022. Potter also noted that people seem more hesitant to make big moves right now. So if you're wondering whether Texas still has drawing power, the answer is yes. But the frantic rush of people piling in has definitely eased. And honestly, that's what makes Texas even more interesting at this stage. Even with rising costs, slower migration, and less of that move here and instantly upgrade your life energy, Texas still added more people than any other state in the country. The Texas Real Estate Research Center summed it up perfectly. People are still moving to Texas, just not at the same speed as before. That really captures the situation. Texas may no longer be in its most explosive growth phase, but it's still operating on a scale that makes other states look small by comparison. So when Texas lands at number 4, don't interpret that as a sign of weakness. Look at it this way. Texas didn't need to win the percentage race to dominate the conversation. Adding nearly 400,000 people in a single year isn't just a trend, it's a force. At number 3, we've got North Carolina. North Carolina takes the third spot, and this is where the countdown stops being subtle and starts making a very clear statement. Because this state isn't just growing quickly, it's growing in a big, noticeable way. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, North Carolina's population increased from 11,052,061 in 2024 to 11,197,968 in 2025. That's a gain of 145,907 residents, translating to about 1.3% growth, and it ranked third nationwide in total population increase. So if you're still thinking of North Carolina as just another pleasant Southern success story, it's time to rethink that. This is large-scale population movement, and it's happening on purpose. People aren't just ending up there randomly. They're choosing it in numbers big enough to demand attention. Here's what really sets North Carolina apart from many other states on this list. Census data clearly shows that its growth is being driven by domestic migration. Not vague momentum, not just natural population increases quietly boosting the totals. This is about real people relocating. Americans are packing up, leaving one state behind, and deliberately moving to North Carolina. The state government highlighted this even further, noting that North Carolina ranked number 1 in net domestic migration, with roughly 84,000 more people moving in from other states than leaving between July 2024 and July 2025. So yes, this is a textbook example of people voting with their feet. And in a year when overall U.S. population growth slowed to just 0.5%, that stands out even more. That's also why North Carolina's growth feels stronger than a lot of the usual relocation hype. It's not just about speed, it's about scale too. Some states can point to high percentage growth, but with relatively small population gains. Others can add a lot of people, but only grow at an average rate. North Carolina managed to do both. It grew fast enough to rank near the top and added enough people to come in just behind Texas and Florida in total numbers. Governor Josh Stein summed it up in classic political fashion, pointing to the state's economic strength, natural beauty, and overall quality of life as reasons people are moving in. And sure, politicians are always going to promote their state. But in this case, the data actually supports the message. What's even more telling is where this trend is heading. Reports indicate that even with slower international migration, North Carolina's growth continues to be driven by domestic movers and its broader economic appeal. State demographer Michael Klein has projected that North Carolina could surpass both Georgia and Ohio early in the next decade, becoming the seventh largest state in the country. That's not a minor detail. That's a signal of long-term positioning. It suggests North Carolina isn't just having a moment. It's building momentum that could reshape its standing nationally. So if you're wondering why this state keeps coming up in relocation conversations, the answer is pretty straightforward. A large number of people have decided that whatever they're looking for, whether it's opportunity, lifestyle, space, or upward momentum, they have a better chance of finding it there. And when that many people keep making the same decision, it stops being hype. It starts becoming the new map. At number 2, we've got Idaho. Idaho lands in the second spot, and at this point, nobody really gets to act surprised anymore. This is one of those states that's been sitting in America's growth conversation for long enough that the "wait, Idaho again?" reaction is starting to wear thin. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, Idaho's population increased from 2,868,872 in 2024 to 2,897,733 in 2025. That's a gain of 28,861 residents, or about 1.4% growth, making Idaho the second fastest growing state in the country, just behind South Carolina. So no, Idaho isn't posting Texas-level population explosions, but that's not really the point. The point is consistency. Idaho keeps growing fast enough to stay near the very top year after year, while many bigger or louder states lean more on reputation than current momentum. Here's what makes Idaho's position even more interesting. The Census Bureau didn't leave much ambiguity about the cause. Like North Carolina, Idaho's growth is being driven primarily by domestic migration. And that detail matters, because it shows this isn't just statistical background noise. It's real decision-making. People are looking around the country, weighing their options, and deciding that Idaho still feels like a better fit than where they currently are. The Idaho Department of Labor adds even more clarity, reporting that net migration accounted for 76% of the state's population growth in 2025, about 22,063 people. Even more striking, around 90% of those new arrivals came from other U.S. states rather than from abroad. So if you're wondering whether Idaho is still actively attracting Americans, the answer is very straightforward: absolutely. What makes Idaho especially interesting is that it's doing all of this without the massive scale advantage of the country's biggest states. Texas can post numbers so large they feel almost unreal. Idaho can't compete on sheer volume, but it doesn't need to. Instead, it consistently outperforms expectations relative to its size. In fact, the Idaho Department of Labor notes that between April 1st, 2020 and July 1st, 2025, the state grew by 10.4%, the fastest growth rate in the entire country over that period. So this isn't just a one-off spike driven by short-term hype or people suddenly discovering mountains and a quieter lifestyle. It's a sustained pattern. Even Boise Dev, reviewing the latest census estimates, pointed out that Idaho's 2025 growth rate only dipped slightly compared to the previous year. In other words, the surge may have cooled a bit, but the underlying engine is still running strong. And that's really the key takeaway here. Idaho isn't ranked number 2 because it's massive. It's ranked number 2 because it continues to attract people at a rate that outpaces nearly every other state. And in a year when overall U.S. population growth slowed to just 0.5%, Census official Christine Hartley noted that much of that slowdown came from a historic drop in net international migration. Even with that broader cooling trend, Idaho still managed 1.4% growth. That's the real signal. Idaho doesn't rely on international surges or a huge population base to stay competitive. It just keeps drawing in Americans steadily enough to make a lot of the country look slower by comparison. And honestly, that's a pretty powerful way to enter the final stretch of this countdown. At number 1, we've got South Carolina. South Carolina takes the top spot. And honestly, this is where the old relocation narrative completely falls apart. For years, people talked as if population growth in America would always belong to the same handful of states, as if the map was permanently fixed and nothing new could ever rise to the top. But the latest data from the U.S. Census Bureau tells a very different story. South Carolina's population increased from 5,490,316 in 2024 to 5,570,274 in 2025. That's an addition of 79,958 residents, making it the fastest growing state in the country with a 1.5% growth rate. So no, South Carolina didn't just accidentally land in first place because other states slowed down. It earned it outright. It grew faster than every other state in the nation in the most recent census release. And what makes that even clearer is what's actually driving the growth. The census data shows South Carolina recorded a net domestic migration gain of 66,622 people. In simple terms, far more people moved into the state from other parts of the U.S. than moved out. That right there is the core of the story. This wasn't primarily international migration, and it wasn't just natural population increase doing the work. It was Americans actively choosing South Carolina. The state's Department of Employment and Workforce put it even more directly, stating that domestic migration was the primary driver of recent population growth. That's about as clear as it gets. People aren't just being born into this increase. They're relocating there in large numbers, deciding that what South Carolina offers is better than what they're leaving behind. And if you've been following this countdown from number 10, you can probably already see the bigger pattern forming. This isn't just a South Carolina story. It's a broader shift in the national migration map. The Associated Press even summarized it bluntly: move over Florida and Texas. That's because the Carolinas have emerged as the new leaders in domestic migration trends. While Florida and Texas are still growing, they're no longer dominating state-to-state migration the way they did during the peak relocation surge. South Carolina ended up with the highest overall growth rate, while North Carolina led the country in net domestic migration. That isn't random. That's a regional shift in momentum. Now, before anyone jumps to the conclusion that South Carolina is some perfect paradise with cheap housing, empty roads, and instant peace of mind, let's slow down a bit. Growth always comes with trade-offs. More people means more demand, more traffic, more pressure on infrastructure, and eventually more frustration from newcomers who realize they weren't the only ones who had the idea to move there. Even South Carolina's own labor market reports point out that growth is already creating uneven pressure in parts of the state. So this isn't a fantasy story. It's a real state experiencing real growth, with all the benefits and challenges that come with it. But that's exactly why South Carolina deserves the #1 position. Because this countdown was never about who has the best branding, the loudest reputation, or the most online hype. It was about where people are actually going based on the latest data. And South Carolina didn't just rank highly, it finished first. Fastest growth rate in the country. Nearly 80,000 new residents in a single year. Over 66,000 net domestic migrants. That's not just momentum, that's a clear signal. Americans are still moving, and they're concentrating their moves into a smaller group of states that feel more affordable, more manageable, or simply more livable than where they came from. And South Carolina ended up being the clearest example of that shift in the latest numbers. So if you were still holding on to the idea that the U.S. relocation map never really changes, this countdown should have made it obvious that it does. The fastest growing states aren't always the ones people expect. The pattern is evolving, the winners are shifting, and the data is telling a very different story than the old assumptions. And South Carolina just happened to be the most striking proof of it all.